Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Chire washing station, wash processed Ethiopia from Lilo Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Lilo, based out of Osaka, Japan. And once again, this coffee was a gift to us from Lucy, so a quick shout out to and thank you to Lucy for this coffee. This is Lilo's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And despite the fact that I'd never tried this coffee roaster before, they are a coffee roaster that I have been aware of for quite a while now, as I do believe Kumquat carries their coffee pretty regularly. And in addition to that, they did miss our cutoff of coffee shops that we were going to review when we were out in Japan. Now, had we had the time to make a trip out to Osaka, then I would have visited their coffee shop and reviewed one of their coffees there. Unfortunately, we did not have enough time to make it out to Osaka, so I'm glad that we'll get an opportunity to review them now, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Lilo's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one's pretty interesting, as once again, it was pretty on par with our experience with Japanese-based coffee roasters. Now, having looked at their coffee on Kumquat's website on numerous occasions, I did have the idea that they were probably a fair bit more developed than I would have particularly liked. That being said, I do have to say that this coffee turned out slightly lighter than I was expecting. Now, even then, this coffee definitely still did skew on the slightly more developed side of things regardless, as I'd recently mentioned Aoma being a little bit more developed for a lot of the coffees that we review, and I can say that this one felt just a slight bit lighter than the Aoma coffees that we had recently reviewed. Even then, it's probably somewhere pretty close to the Solcott coffee that we had also reviewed. So for that reason, I would say they're probably on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was pretty on par with the expectations that we did have for this coffee, as it was pretty developed overall, which did hinder a little bit of the clarity. Now, there was an expected floral and citric component with plenty of the tea-like aspects in terms of the base, with a little generic of a start for a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, so that lent itself towards an okay first impression, and that was pretty on par with a lot of the expectations that I did have, though even then I said I fully expected this to probably be pretty close to that Aoma coffee, maybe pretty close to the acid coffee, but even then it wasn't quite that developed. Day 23 through the Chemex, and there are pros and cons to this one, as there's definitely a little bit of that lingering developed quality to it, but there are also notable stone fruits on the back end, and that kind of made up for it, because if there's a way that we're going to really enjoy a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, it's going to be if it's offering plenty of stone fruit aspects to it. Outside of that, there was a slight paperiness that did feel a little bit more pronounced than I was expecting, with the overall sweetness being a little bit more moderate all around. Intensity wasn't particularly high, and as a result, I would say that the impressions have been pretty mixed all around based off these first two tries. Day 26 through the UFO Brewer, and there were more mixed impressions of this one, as it did definitely help settle some of the more developed and papery qualities of it, as it has been toned down and a little bit more tame overall. It has allowed for a more abundant tea-like base with a better honeyed quality to it, so just plenty more depth this time around, mostly because we were able to tone down some of the less desirable aspects of this one. Day 29 through the V60 with Lilo's recipe, and in our Solcott review, I mentioned that we opted for one of the coffee roasters recipes to use on all those coffees, and that was this Lilo recipe, because I actually had some really nice results brewing this coffee with that recipe, as it was by far the best it had been to this point, as there's significantly better definition to the coffee with a more prominent tart citric quality that's in line with a bit of a lemon and yuzu-like sense. In addition to that, there's a slightly bitter grapefruit zest to it as well. But for the most part, it's been pretty bright and honeyed sweet all around, so definitely significant improvement from what was a little bit of a papery and slightly developed feel before that. Day 32 through the Chemex with these same adjustments, and the coffee was a little less impressive through this brew method, as it does have a slightly more generic feel to it, with a little bit more of the robustness all around, slightly less sweetness as well, but it was just a less impressive day overall as a result. Day 35 through the V60 with Lilo's recipe, and it feels like the coffee might already be on the decline, as it wasn't quite as good as that day 29 mark, with a little bit more of the robust qualities presented yet again. Bright, but in a slightly less defined sense, with the focus being mostly on the citric aspects of this one. We'll go ahead and move on to day 38 as we opted for the Chemex with Lilo's recipe, and it was a little bit better than the previous Chemex day, as it has a little bit of inconsistency to it, primarily citric forward with some slight complementary stone fruit aspects, which were pretty inconsistent within this coffee. I would say that the citric aspects were a little bit more pronounced and consistent, and there were times we were able to get a little bit of a stone fruit finish to it, but for the most part, it was those slightly more bitter and zesty citric qualities that defined this one. Day 41. Final notes we have through the V60 with the lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee is very direct for being a slightly more developed wash processed Ethiopian coffee, as it does have a pretty bright lemon aspect to it and a nice candied sweetness in a honey sense. White floral qualities with some subtle peach to it as well, so this day definitely did bring out a little bit more, at least as far as the notes go. Alright, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And I remember making this tasting wheel and thinking to myself that this is actually a pretty normal looking tasting wheel for this coffee, but let's go through it. We have a lot of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Now, in the same way that the Mario Moreno coffee from Solcott didn't have enough of a roasty quality to just hinder the overall cleanliness of it, kind of the same case with this one. You can see that the smokiness is there at the level 2 mark, which does indicate that there was a fair bit of those roasty qualities to this one, but not enough to the point where it hindered the overall experience, especially given that there was some really nice definition to the citric qualities specifically, and the floral qualities. So for that reason, we decided to put it there at the level 4 mark. Not necessarily the highest level 4, but it did reach that, mostly because there's not enough to hinder that. Finish, level 4. There were times when the finish did skew in that stone fruit sense, and when it did, that was my favorite experience of this coffee. Outside of that, we were able to get some honeyed aspects to it, but for the most part, pretty citric forward, definitely a little bit more of a bitter citric quality to it, which is why the bitterness is a little bit higher at that level 2 mark. Let's go ahead and move on. Sweetness, level 4. Probably a little generous, though at the same time, it did have a little bit more intensity than your average wash processed Ethiopian coffee. I will say I would probably take a slightly more developed but sweeter washed Ethiopian coffee than something that is very light and a little boring, scoring low at that level 3 mark for the sweetness, which might be blasphemy, but at the same time, I just want a little bit more intensity and a little bit more depth to my wash processed coffees, and that did seem to help this one, even if it wasn't necessarily the highest level of sweetness to it. Acidity, level 4. That one is probably the biggest surprising aspect of this coffee, as it was very bright, especially in terms of the citric qualities to it. And given the profile of this one being a little bit more on the developed side of things, I think that they have this one listed as being light by their standards. So kind of interesting nonetheless that it did score as high as it did in the brightness, mostly in that citric sense. Florality, level 4. I mentioned on some of the earlier days that there was a honeyed floral quality to this one, but there are also some white floral aspects to it as well. Not necessarily the best or most well-defined within this coffee, but even then it was prominent enough, which is not surprising still that it's a wash-processed Ethiopian. Citrus fruit, level 4. I mentioned a handful of citric qualities to it: yuzu, lemon, grapefruit, a lot of these on the more bitter citric side of things, and for that reason it is on the higher side, and it did accompany the brightness as well as the bitterness, as those seem to be the most defining traits and aspects within this coffee. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next thing, which is the one level 3 that we do have. Stone fruit, level 3. I don't know what the notes of this coffee actually are. I don't think that they have it listed on the bag, and I don't think that I was able to find much information about this coffee specifically. I had a little bit of difficulty finding information about a number of these coffees that we're reviewing from these Japanese-based coffee roasters, but I think for that reason I didn't know exactly what they had listed as the notes for this coffee, but I was able to pick out some more peachy qualities to this one, which is why it did score there at the level 3 mark. I mentioned throughout the notes, not the most consistent quality within this coffee, but pronounced enough to be at that more moderate level. And let's go ahead and move on to the final thing worth discussing, body level 2. At the end of the day, it's still a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, so it's not too surprising that it was a little bit more tea-like, but not to the extent of your Gesha coffees. So for that reason, just lighter bodied in general. And outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I kind of mentioned that while we were going through the tasting wheel that it's fine. I would rather take something like this that just does have this level of intensity than something that is very boring for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. That being said, a lot of the intensity did skew in a direction that isn't necessarily my favorite. I've never been the biggest fan of the citric qualities of a coffee in general. And for me, this one would have been a significantly bigger winner had it skewed much more in the stone fruit side of things. Maybe kind of reverse those two things, have the stone fruit level 4 and then the citrus fruit level 3. But I still feel like it was pretty hindered by the overall development of this coffee because this is probably a little bit more developed than I particularly like for a coffee like this. But even then, given my expectations for this coffee roaster going into it, I do have to say that it probably exceeded my expectations slightly, even if they weren't necessarily the highest expectations for this coffee going into it. So I'd be kind of curious to try some other things from this coffee roaster, maybe something that isn't a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. I've mentioned that they're probably my least favorite coffees to review in general, mostly because had a million wash processed Ethiopian coffees, so there needs to be something to differentiate them from each other. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to though, I feel like if you really like your citric aspects of your Ethiopian coffees and you don't mind a little bit more developed of a profile to begin with, I think it's made up for with the slightly higher level of sweetness and intensity that it does offer. So that does balance out the fact that it isn't necessarily the lightest coffee. In addition to that, it's got a little bit more brightness and some floral qualities too that gives this one a little bit more depth. So it just has a little bit more for your average wash processed Ethiopian coffee in general. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Lilo, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Chire washing station, wash processed Ethiopia from Lilo Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.